The Arizona sun doesn't just shine, it punishes. And on Sarah Thompson's small homestead, it felt like a sentence. 6 months. 6 months since the fever took her husband, James, and left her with nothing but a 10-year-old son and a piece of land that was slowly dying with her spirit. She was hanging laundry, the fabric hot and stiff in her hands, when her boy, Thomas, called out. He was holding up a rabbit, his face a mixture of pride and a sadness that was too old for his years. A mirror image of his father. "Look, Ma." She forced a smile that felt like cracking earth. "Well done, Tommy. That'll make a fine stew." But his face fell. "Pa would have shown me how to skin it proper." The words were a punch to the gut. She was trying to be both mother and father, but some things a boy needed a man for. She blinked back the burn in her eyes. "I'll help you, just like your father showed me." Later, as the shadows grew long and the heat finally broke, Thomas asked a question that hung in the air like dust. "Why don't we ever see any Indians, Ma?" Sarah kept her hands busy, her voice steady. "They keep to themselves, Tommy. The Apache. And that's for the best." But even as she said it, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coming night. That evening, with Thomas asleep, she took her usual spot on the porch. The rifle across her lap had become as familiar as a blanket. Every coyote howl, every rustle in the brush, sent a jolt through her. This ranch was James's dream. Selling it felt like burying him all over again. But staying felt like a slow suicide. Then she heard it. Not a coyote. Not the wind. A twig snap. Sharp. Close. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she raised the rifle, the wooden stock smooth and cold against her cheek. "I mean no harm." The voice came from the darkness, deep and calm. A figure stepped into the moonlight, hands raised, tall, broad, an Apache. He wore a strange mix of his people's clothes and the white man's. A weathered army blanket was draped over his shoulders. Sarah kept the rifle aimed square at his chest. "State your business." "My name is Nakoi," he said. His English was perfect. Unsettlingly so. "I have twin daughters. Their mother. She died 3 days ago. Fever." Sarah's grip on the rifle didn't loosen. "I'm sorry for your loss, but that has nothing to do with me." A flicker of something raw and desperate crossed his stoic face. "The babies need milk. They will not survive." He took another step. "I heard there was a woman here. A kind woman." "Who told you that?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "The traitor, Williams. He said you lost your husband. He said you might understand." He was close enough now that she could see the grief etched around his eyes. A grief she knew all too well. "I have hunting skills," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Your boy needs to learn a man's ways. My girls need milk. We can help each other." Her mind raced. She had no milk. Thomas was 10. "I can't nurse your babies," she said flatly. "My milk dried up years ago." "Goat's milk," he shot back, his desperation clear now. "Their mother's sister tried, but she's gone. To the reservation. I will not go there. It is a place of death." She looked at him, really looked at him, the pride warring with the pain. 2 motherless babies, starving, somewhere out there in the dark. "Where are they?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Hidden. Safe. I would not bring them into danger." That was it. That was the moment. Her own grief recognized his. Her own fight recognized his. She lowered the rifle just an inch. "Bring them here." The relief that washed over his face was so profound, it was almost painful to watch. He melted back into the shadows and returned moments later with a bundle wrapped in deerskin. As he stepped onto the porch, the night was broken by the thinnest, weakest cries she had ever heard. Cries that sounded like the end of hope. She led him inside, lit a lamp, her hands shaking. "Let me see them." He unwrapped the bundle. 2 tiny infants. So small. Their copper skin was stretched tight over their little bones. Their cries were barely a flutter of sound. They were dying. "Right away," Sarah breathed, already moving to the kitchen. She warmed the goat's milk, her movements frantic. She fashioned 2 small cloth feeders, her mind a blur. "What are their names?" "Ayana and Kiona," he said, his eyes never leaving his daughter's. As she showed him how to hold the feeder, how to coax the warm milk into their mouths, the world seemed to shrink to the 4 of them in that small, lamplit kitchen. Nakohe's hard face softened as he watched them drink, their tiny hands clutching at his fingers. "You saved their lives," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. Sarah met his gaze, the rifle forgotten on the porch. "For tonight, yes. But they need more than I can give." "I will not go to the reservation," he repeated, his voice like stone. "It is a slow death of spirit, then body." "Then what do you propose?" she asked, already knowing she was in too deep to turn back now. "I will build a shelter, hunt for you, protect this place, teach your boy to be a man." His eyes held hers, a silent binding contract. "In return you help me feed my daughters." Everything in her screamed to say no, to send him away. The town, the talk, the danger. But then she looked down at the 2 tiny faces, their bellies finally full, their weak cries silenced. She thought of Thomas, sleeping alone in his room, a boy without a father. "1 week," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Stay, 1 week. We'll see." As she showed him to the barn, a place for him and his daughters to sleep, she felt the weight of her choice settle over her. She hadn't just saved 2 babies tonight. She had invited a storm into her home, and she had no idea if any of them would survive it. The next morning, Sarah found him not in the barn, but at the edge of her property. He was already building a lean-to, his movements swift and sure. The twin girls were nearby, sleeping in a cradle he'd woven from branches. It was ingenious, and it was terrifyingly permanent. "You work fast," she said, her voice tight. He didn't look up. "The sun is hot, the babies need shade." She'd brought a basket with breakfast and more milk. As if on cue, one of the twins began to fuss. Nakohe moved with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his powerful frame. "This is Ayana," he said, a rare smile touching his lips. "She always wakes first." As they fed the babies together, a strange rhythm began to form between them. It was a partnership born of pure necessity. "How did you learn our language so well?" she asked, breaking the silence. His face hardened. The smile vanished. "Mission school. I was a boy. They took us." He looked away toward the mountains. "I ran away after 2 winters. But I learned enough. Learned to understand the white man's ways, his lies." Before she could process the bitterness in his voice, a shout came from the house. It was Thomas. "Ma! There's an Indian!" He stood at the back door, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear he'd learned from town gossip and campfire stories. "It's all right, Tommy," Sarah said, her voice calmer than she felt. "Come meet our guests." The boy crept forward, half hiding behind her skirts. He stared at the tall Apache man, at the baby in his arms. "Are you a real warrior?" Thomas asked, his voice a squeak. Nakohe nodded, his expression unreadable. "I was. Now, I am a father." "Where's their ma?" Thomas asked, his childhood innocence cutting through the tension. "She walks with the spirits now," Nakohe said quietly. Thomas's face softened. He understood that. "Like my pa." He took a step closer, finally looking at the baby. "They're awful small." Sarah saw her opening. "Kiona is waking up," she said, nodding to the other twin. "Would you like to help feed her?" To her astonishment, Thomas nodded. He held the little cloth feeder, his hand clumsy but gentle, as the tiny girl drank. A real smile, the first she'd seen in weeks, lit up his face. "She's strong," he said, grabbing my finger and everything. Later, Nakohe looked at Thomas. "Your mother says you wish to learn to hunt." Thomas's eyes went wide. "Yes, sir. Pa was teaching me, but—" "We begin today," Nakohe said. He looked to Sarah for permission. She hesitated for a heartbeat, the warnings of the town echoing in her head. Then she looked at her son's hopeful face. "Stay within shouting distance," she said. The days fell into a pattern. Every morning, the warrior and the boy would disappear into the brush. They'd return with rabbits or quail, Thomas buzzing with stories of tracking and signs. Sarah would care for the twins, a surprising warmth filling the empty spaces in her heart. They were a strange, broken little family. But for a few days, it almost felt whole. Then, on the 5th day, she saw the riders, 3 of them, and they were heading straight for her. It was Sheriff Mills. "Stay inside," she hissed to Thomas. "Take the babies to the back room and stay quiet." She grabbed the rifle. She met the men at the edge of her property, the gun held loosely in her hands, a silent warning. "Afternoon, Sheriff," she said, her voice level. "Something brings you out this way." Mills tipped his hat, but his eyes were hard. "Mrs. Thompson, word is you've got yourself an Indian problem." "No problem here," she said. "Williams, at the post, says you've been buying extra milk. For babies." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Says an Apache brave's been seen on your property." One of the other men, Frank Doyle, a rancher from the next valley, spat on the ground. "Ain't proper, Sarah. A white woman, alone, with a savage." Her grip tightened on the rifle. "My arrangements are my own business, Mr. Doyle." "Be reasonable, Sarah," the sheriff sighed. "There's a reservation for these people. If he's got children, they belong there, too. It's for their own good." Her own good? She'd been drowning, and this man, this stranger, had been a lifeline. "Since my husband died," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden rage, "this place has been falling apart. Now, there's meat on my table. My son is learning the things his father can no longer teach him. You tell me what's for my own good, Sheriff." "What happens when more come?" The third man, Peterson, chimed in. "1 Indian leads to 10. You're putting us all at risk." "He's alone," she insisted. "His wife died. His babies were starving." The sheriff shook his head, his patience gone. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I have my orders. The Army's cracking down after those raids last spring. All Apache not on reservation land are to be brought in." "He had nothing to do with those raids!" she cried, though a cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. How could she know for sure? "Where is he?" the sheriff demanded, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. As if summoned, Nakohe emerged from the trees. Thomas was at his side. They carried a string of rabbits. He saw the mounted men and stopped, his body going still, a protective hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Go to your mother, boy," Sheriff Mills commanded. Thomas didn't move. He looked from Nakohe to the sheriff, his face a mask of confusion and defiance. "It's all right, Tommy," Sarah said gently. "Come here." He went to her, but his eyes stayed on Nakohe. The sheriff dismounted. "You're coming with us, Indian." Nakohe stood tall, his face impassive rock. "My daughters are inside. They are too small for the journey." "We'll see they get proper care," the sheriff said, but his voice lacked any real conviction. Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between them. "Sheriff, please, give us time. The babies are too fragile." "Can't do it, Sarah. The law is the law." A desperate, wild idea bloomed in her mind. "Then I'll go to the governor," she declared. "I'll write to every newspaper from here to California. I'll ask them what kind of men tear newborn babies from their father's arms. Would you do the same if they were white children?" The men shifted in their saddles. Doyle looked away. She saw a flicker of uncertainty in the sheriff's eyes, and she pressed her advantage. 3 weeks. That's all I ask. The babies will be stronger. We can make arrangements." Sheriff Mills stared at her, then at Nakoe, then at the ground. He chewed on his lip, cornered. Finally, he spat. 3 weeks, he growled. He swung back onto his horse, his face dark with fury. "But then he goes. Or I'll be back, Mrs. Thompson. And I'll bring more men." As they rode away, a cloud of dust and threats hanging in the air, Sarah's knees almost gave out. She had won. For now. But it wasn't a reprieve. It was a deadline. Nakohe approached her, his eyes searching her face. "You risk much for us," he said, his voice low. "Why?" She met his gaze, the harsh sunlight making her squint. "Because you've kept your word," she said. and because it's the right thing to do. But that night, as they sat in the darkness, the stars cold and distant above them, she knew the truth. It was more than that. Her life, her son's life, had become tangled up with his, and she was terrified of what would happen when the sheriff came back to cut them apart. The 3 weeks the sheriff had given them felt less like a reprieve and more like a ticking clock. Every sunset was a reminder that their time was running out. One night, after Thomas was asleep, Sarah found Nakohe staring up at the stars. "They will come back," she said, stating the obvious. "Yes." His voice was flat, resigned. "What will you do?" He was silent for a long time. "There are places in the mountains, places the white man does not go. But the journey, it would be hard on the little ones. They might not survive." Sarah's heart sank. It was a death sentence either way. The reservation or the mountains. A desperate plan, born of fear and a strange, fierce protectiveness, had been forming in her mind. She took a deep breath. What if there was another way? The next morning, the tension was a physical thing between them. She found him by the chicken coop, his face grim. He'd clearly been awake all night, same as her. "You have thought more on your words?" he asked without preamble. She nodded, glancing toward the house. "They could come back sooner than 3 weeks. We need a plan, a real plan, one that gives you a right to be here." "What do you propose?" His dark eyes were intense, searching. She just said it. "Marriage." He didn't flinch, but she saw his shoulders tense. He thought she was mocking him. "Hear me out," she said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. "On paper only. A legal fiction. If you are my husband, they can't force you onto the reservation. The law would protect you. The girls would be under my protection too." He looked at her with deep skepticism. "The white man's law protects such a thing?" "Not everywhere," she admitted. "But James, my husband, he once spoke of the territorial judge in Prescott, said he was a fair man. If we could just get to him." He was quiet for so long she thought he would refuse. "This would bring you much trouble," he said finally. "The people in town already hate you for this." "People always talk," she snapped, a flare of bitterness in her voice. "They talked when I insisted on keeping this ranch, said a woman couldn't manage it. I care more about doing what's right than what's easy." "And your boy?" That question stopped her. She hadn't spoken to Thomas yet. Just then, he burst out of the house, his face bright with excitement. "Nakohe, are we going to the creek? You promised to show me how to catch fish with my hands." Nakohe's stern face softened. "Yes, after breakfast, we will go." As she watched them together, this Apache warrior and her fatherless son, her resolve hardened. This was right. It had to be. After they ate, she pulled Thomas aside. "Tommy, I need to talk to you." "Is it about the sheriff?" he asked, his young face clouded with worry. "Are they coming back for Nakohe?" "They might," she said. "That's why I need to do something. Something to make sure he and the twins can stay here, legally." "How?" She took a deep breath. "I'm thinking of marrying Nakohe." She saw the confusion in his eyes and hurried to explain. "Not like with your father. It would be a partnership, a way to protect them." Thomas was quiet, processing this enormous idea. "So, he would be my pa?" "No one could ever replace your father," she said gently. "But Nakohe, he could be a guardian, for all of us." Thomas looked out at the lean-to, where the twins were sleeping. He looked toward the creek, where Nakohe was waiting for him. Then he looked at his mother, his expression startlingly adult. "I think Pa would understand," he said quietly. "He always said we should do what's right, even when it's hard." Tears sprang to her eyes. She hugged him tight, burying her face in his sandy hair. That evening, they planned their escape. It wasn't an elopement. It was a mission. "It's a 3-day journey to Prescott," she explained, spreading out a worn map. "We'll need to leave quietly. Williams at the trading post is a friend. I'll go in tomorrow, get supplies. I'll ask him to keep quiet. The town will know before we are gone, Nakohe stated. It wasn't a question. Then we'll have to be fast, she said. We'll leave in 2 days. At dawn. She went to town the next day, her stomach in knots. The trading post was quiet. Edward, she said, getting straight to it. I need supplies for a long journey. And I need your discretion. Williams, a kind man who had been friends with James, raised an eyebrow. This have something to do with your visitor? The whole town was buzzing. It does, she said. I'm going to marry him. He nearly dropped a sack of flour. Sarah, you can't be serious. Deadly serious, Edward. It's the only way. He shook his head, his face a mask of concern. You'll be an outcast. I already am, she replied. He studied her for a long moment, then sighed. James was a good man. He'd want me to look after you. He packed her supplies. I'll keep quiet, but I can only promise you until tomorrow evening. Frank Doyle was in here this morning, buying ammunition. He and some others. They aren't waiting for the sheriff, Sarah. A cold dread washed over her. She raced the wagon back to the homestead, the wheels spinning, the warning echoing in her ears. That night, as they packed the last of their things, Nakohe suddenly went still. He moved to the door, listening. What is it? She whispered. Riders, he said, his voice a low growl. Many, coming fast. Her blood ran cold. They can't know. Williams promised. Not all men keep promises. Thomas appeared in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Ma? Get dressed. Now, she commanded. She turned to Nakohe, her mind racing. There's a back trail, through the wash. It's rough, but we might make it. He nodded, already moving, sweeping up the twins and wrapping them securely. I will drive. You take the rifle. The sound of hoofbeats was growing louder, a drumbeat of doom. They worked in a desperate, silent panic, throwing the last of their supplies into the wagon. Sarah helped a terrified Thomas into the back, then climbed onto the seat beside Nakohe, the rifle heavy across her lap. Just as they urged the horses down the dark, bumpy trail, they saw them. Torchlight flooded the yard they had just abandoned. Figures on horseback. They'll follow, she breathed, her voice tight with fear. Yes, Nakohe said, his face a grim silhouette against the night. But we have a head start, and I know the ways of the mountains. As they rounded a bend, Sarah looked back. She saw the men dismounting, their angry faces lit by the flickering torches. She saw Frank Doyle point in their direction. Then, the night was split by the crack of a rifle shot. A bullet whizzed past her head, so close she felt its heat. Nakohe yelled at the horses, whipping the reins. The wagon lurched forward, crashing through a fence and into the open desert. They were running for their lives. The escape was a blur of chaos and fear. Hoofbeats thundered behind them, closing the distance. The shouts of Doyle and his men were carried on the night air, ugly and full of hate. Another shot rang out, splintering the wood of the wagon bed just inches from where Thomas huddled over the twins. Get down! Sarah screamed, shoving her son flat. She turned, raised her own rifle, and fired back into the darkness, not aiming to hit, but to slow them down. Nakohe drove the wagon with a terrifying skill, weaving through cactus and rock, urging the horses to a speed that threatened to tear the wagon apart. He veered sharply off the trail, plunging them into a deep sandy wash where the tracks would be harder to follow. For a few frantic minutes the sounds of pursuit faded. They were in the mountains now, Nakohe's territory. He guided them through a labyrinth of canyons and ravines, the moonlight their only guide. By the time the sun began to bleed across the eastern sky, the sounds of their pursuers were gone. They were alone, but they were fugitives. The journey was a 3-day nightmare. The terrain was brutal. Nakohe was relentless, pushing them onward, stopping only when the babies cried with hunger or the horses were ready to drop. Thomas, to his credit, never complained. He was a small, silent shadow, helping his mother with the twins, his eyes wide with a fear he was trying his best to hide. On the third evening, as they made a small, smokeless fire in a hidden alcove, Sarah finally asked the question that had been haunting her. Do you think the judge will even see us? Let alone help us? Nakohe stared into the flames, his face carved from shadow and light. "I do not know the white man's law," he said slowly, "but I know courage. You have shown courage for my daughters." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and piercing. "And you have given your son something I could not." "A connection to his father," she whispered, her throat tight. "He idolized James." "The boy has a strong spirit," Nakohe observed. "He will be a good man." They fell into a silence that was deeper than just a lack of words. In the crucible of their escape, something had shifted between them. The marriage was a fiction, a desperate gambit, but the partnership was real. It had been forged in shared fear and a grim determination to survive. They rode into Prescott the next afternoon, looking like what they were: refugees. The town was bigger, busier, and more intimidating than she remembered. Stairs followed them down the main street. An Apache man, a white woman, a white boy, and 2 native babies. They were a spectacle, a puzzle that people stared at with open hostility. They found a boarding house run by a stern-faced widow who looked them up and down, but took Sarah's gold coins without a word. After they had washed away the grime of the trail, Sarah knew she had to face the courthouse alone. "It will be better if I go first," she told Nakohe. He nodded, his jaw tight. "Be careful," he warned. "These towns have their own laws." The courthouse was a formidable stone building. The clerk, a young man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked at her as if she'd grown a second head when she stated her purpose. "A marriage license? Between yourself and an Apache?" His voice was a shocked squeak. "Is Judge Harrison available?" she asked, keeping her own voice firm. "The judge is busy. His docket is full. Perhaps you should reconsider this arrangement." "Is that Mrs. Thompson?" A deep voice boomed from a nearby doorway. A tall, gray-haired man in judicial robes appeared, Judge Franklin Harrison. "Judge," Sarah said, relief washing over her. "You remember me?" He studied her. "James Thompson's widow, a good man. Served on a jury for me once." His eyes narrowed. "My clerk says you're here on a rather unusual matter." "May we speak privately, Your Honor?" He hesitated, then nodded, ushering her into his chambers. For an hour, she poured out the whole story. Nakohe, the dying babies, the sheriff, the escape, the mob led by Frank Doyle. She left nothing out. "So this marriage is a matter of legal protection," he clarified when she was done. "Yes," she said, "but we have become partners in survival." Judge Harrison leaned back, steepling his fingers. He looked out the window at the town below. "Mrs. Thompson, what you're proposing is highly irregular. Intermarriage isn't illegal in this territory, but it's certainly unheard of. It would be challenged." Her heart plummeted. "Then you won't help us." "I didn't say that." The judge turned back from the window, his expression thoughtful. "I have long believed the reservation system is a stain upon our nation, forcing a proud people into pens like cattle." He looked her straight in the eye. "Bring your Apache friend and the children to my home. Tonight, 8 o'clock. My wife will want to meet you all." A fragile hope flickered to life. "Thank you, Your Honor." But as she left the courthouse, her hope turned to ice. A small crowd had gathered in the street. At the center of it was Nakohe. He was holding both twins, his body a shield around them. A man, beefy and red-faced with a military-style mustache, was jabbing a finger in his face. "I know you! You're one of them from the San Carlos raid last spring! There's a price on your head!" the man yelled. Sarah's blood ran cold. The very raids the sheriff had mentioned. The raids she had sworn Nakohe had nothing to do with. Nakohe backed away slowly, his eyes scanning for an escape, his face a mask of stone. But there was nowhere to go. The crowd was closing in, their faces turning ugly. Thomas stood behind him, clutching his leg, trying to be brave. Sarah pushed through the crowd, just as the man lunged for Nakohe. "Leave him alone," she screamed. The man turned on her. "This savage is a wanted murderer, lady, and you're protecting him." The town marshal was pushing through the crowd now, his hand on his gun. It was all falling apart. They had escaped the fire only to land in the furnace. Nakohe looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not guilt, but a deep, hunted despair. They were trapped. The marshal pushed his way to the center of the circle, his face grim. "All right, break it up. What's going on here?" "This Apache," the red-faced man spat, pointing a trembling finger at Nakohe. "He's wanted, from the San Carlos raid. I was stationed at Fort Apache. I saw the posters myself." Panic seized Sarah. The judge, their meeting. It was all about to be lost. "He's with me," she said, her voice shaking but loud enough to be heard. "He is under my protection." The crowd laughed. The marshal ignored her, his eyes fixed on Nakohe, who stood silent and still as a statue, the babies clutched to his chest. "You have a name?" the marshal asked. Before Nakohe could answer, a voice cut through the tension. "He does, and he has an appointment." Judge Harrison stood on the steps of the courthouse, his black robes giving him an air of absolute authority. The crowd fell silent. The marshal looked startled. "Judge?" "This man and his family are my guests this evening," the judge said, his voice like rolling thunder. "If you have a problem, you can take it up with me. In my court. Tomorrow morning." He stared down the red-faced accuser. "And you had better be damn sure of your facts, mister. I don't take kindly to false accusations in my town." The man sputtered, his bluster deflating under the judge's cold glare. The crowd began to melt away, whispering amongst themselves. The marshal tipped his hat. "As you say, Judge," Judge Harrison beckoned to them. "Come along, Mrs. Thompson. We have much to discuss." They followed him, a strange procession through the streets of Prescott. They arrived at the judge's large, impressive home on a hill overlooking the town. A kind-faced woman, Mrs. Harrison, met them at the door. She didn't seem to notice Nakohe's race or their ragged clothes. Her eyes went straight to the babies. "Oh, you poor little things," she cooed, gently taking Kiona from Nakohe's arms. She led them into a warm parlor, where Thomas was given a cookie and a glass of milk. Then the judge led Nakohe into his study and closed the door. Sarah sat with Mrs. Harrison, trying to make small talk, but her mind was screaming. Was he a murderer? Had she risked everything for a lie? The minutes stretched into an hour. Finally, the study door opened. The judge's face was serious. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, "Nakohe has told me everything." He paused, and Sarah held her breath. He was not part of the raid. His wife was ill with the fever. He was trying to take her to a medicine man in the mountains, away from the violence. They were caught between the raiders and the soldiers. His wife was killed in the crossfire. Sarah looked at Nakohe, who stood by the fireplace, his face etched with a pain so deep it was hard to look at. "The soldiers found him with his dead wife," the judge continued. "It was easier to name him a raider than to admit an innocent woman had been killed. He escaped with his newborns before they could ship him to the prison camp in Florida. So that was the truth. Not a savage. A man trying to save his family, who had lost everything." The judge sat down, his expression grim. "A marriage license is out of the question. It would be contested immediately by the army. They want him, and they would use the marriage to get to him, and possibly take your son from you for consorting with a known fugitive." All hope drained from her. It was over. "However," the judge said, a glint in his eye, "there is another way. A legal loophole, you might say." He explained his plan. It was audacious. It was brilliant. There was land available in the Northern Territory. Homestead land. "I can't grant it to an Apache," he said. "The law is clear. But I can grant it to a legal partnership, a business." Nakohe stepped forward. "The judge offers us land, in both our names, as partners in a ranching enterprise." "A partnership homestead," the judge said with a small, grim smile. "It's unusual, but it's legal. It gives you both equal claim to the land. And as the head of a civilized enterprise, as the government so delicately puts it, Nakohe would be exempt from the reservation orders." Sarah's mind reeled. And the wanted poster? The army? "I will issue a judicial exemption," the judge declared. "As a territorial judge, I have the authority to override a military warrant within my jurisdiction, especially when I believe the charges to be false. It's a gamble. It will make me some powerful enemies, but it's the right thing to do. He then turned to the final piece. The children. They will be registered as your legal wards, Sarah, with Nakohe named as their father, with full and preserved parental rights. You will be their legal protector, and he will be their father. A double layer of protection. 2 days later, they stood in his chambers, the official documents in hand. The partnership homestead grant for 320 acres in a place called Pine Valley. The judicial exemption, the guardianship papers. It was a shield made of paper and ink, but it was the strongest shield in the world. As they left the courthouse, blinking in the bright sunlight, a new life ahead of them, Thomas ran ahead, giddy with relief. Will there be fish in Pine Valley, Nakohe? Yes, Nakohe said, and for the first time, Sarah saw him truly smile. And deer, and rabbits, many things to learn. As they walked toward the livery to buy a new, sturdier wagon for the journey north, Sarah saw them. Sheriff Mills and Frank Doyle, riding into town. They looked tired, angry, and they had clearly tracked them all the way here. They saw Sarah and Nakohe and pulled their horses to a halt. Mills's eyes were full of hate. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah held up the papers, the judge's official seal gleaming in the sun. Mills stared at the documents, his face turning a dark red. He was beaten. The law he claimed to uphold had protected them from him. He couldn't touch them. Without a word, he yanked his horse's reins and rode away, Doyle trailing behind him like a beaten dog. They had won. That evening, as they prepared to leave Prescott at dawn, Sarah found Nakohe on the boarding house porch, watching the last colors of the sunset fade from the sky. It won't be easy, she said quietly. People will still judge. He turned to her, his expression serene. My people have a saying. It is better to have less thunder in the mouth and more lightning in the hand. We have acted. She smiled. My father used to say, judge a person by their deeds, not their words. Your father was a wise man, Nakohe said, as you are a wise woman. They stood in a comfortable silence, the two of them. A widow and a widower. A white woman and an Apache man, survivors. What will we tell them? Sarah asked, her voice soft. When they're older, about all of this? Nakohe looked at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. We will tell them the truth, he said. That when they needed a mother, one came. When a boy needed a father, one came. That sometimes a family is not made of blood. It is made of choice, of courage. Tears pricked her eyes. He was right. They weren't a husband and wife. They were something else, something stronger. Partners. A family forged in fire and loss, bound by a promise to build something new in a valley of pines. The future was an unmarked trail, but for the first time in a very long time, Sarah wasn't afraid to walk it. They had lost their homes, but they had found each other. And that, she knew, was everything. If you enjoyed this story of a family built against all odds, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss our next strange story. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what you thought of Sarah and Nakohe's incredible journey. Thanks for watching.